I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our moderator, Don Marin. Don has a distinguished career, both professionally and through the art world. Right now he's with Lightyear Capital, and formerly, and he probably is best known for being the chairman and CEO of PaineWebber. And while at PaineWebber, he built one of the great collections of contemporary art and showed the financial world what can really be done with doing things like that. Don also served as president of the Museum of Modern Art. He was vice chairman when CalArts got started in the early days, and he's also managed to professionally and personally collect art, and he's built one of the great collections that this country is seeing. It's all yours, Don.
Thank you very much. Coming from him, that really means something. Now, I said to the management of this place today, I can see where art fits in this whole thing. It comes in the last day of the convention. They put it in the hardest room to find in the whole place. And it isn't even a room, it's a tent. But they said, oh no, you have to understand we saved the best for last. So you can decide which interpretation really works. The topic of art and money, which is what they said it is, and what I said I never wanted to talk about, is a pretty controversial one. People today are very optimistic about buying art and actually call it an investment. And I hope that after this session is over, everybody here will have a better balanced sense of what about art might have some investment characteristics, but there's an awful lot about art that doesn't. And the key thing is you can't collect art unless you start with passion. And I think that you'd agree with that.
Very much
for
so.
sure. And that passion has to stay with you all the way through the process. Otherwise, there's an empty feeling at the end of it, and it turns into trading stamps, and it doesn't work as well as that. But the way I'd like to start is just to offer a top-down view of the three aspects of art that we're going to cover today, and the three most important: artists, museums, and other academic institutions, and commerce. And commerce includes collectors and dealers and auction houses and agents and advisors. And those three combined make up what's going on in the art world, and they have changed substantially over the last 10 years because of the scale of the art world globally and because of the economics in them. Starting with artists, for example, all you had to do was have gone to the Piers in New York about a month ago and saw that fair where there were hundreds of dealers packed together showing hundreds and hundreds of artists, mainly abstract, and you just had a feeling of being overwhelmed. And the only thing that you knew for sure out of all these hundreds of artists is only a few would actually survive and be good. And the pressure on these artists to do something is extraordinary. For example, one simple example is when an artist gets himself or herself to the point of having a work that's popular or in demand, there's great pressure on the part of the marketplace to keep making that kind of art. When in fact, most of the great artists do something that's unique and makes an impact and then stop and move on to the next phase of their career. And that doesn't help artists at all the way through. It also gets artists thinking about money in a way that they never intended to. So we're going to explore that. In terms of museums, museums have changed dramatically in the last 15 years. I did a study that MoMA wanted us to do on the trends in art over the next 10 years. And I did it a couple of years ago. And the first question I asked the staff was, give me a list of all the new museums that are being built in the world that collect and show contemporary artists. And I thought they'd come back with 5 or 10. The answer was 60. And when you looked at all those museums, you found there were some common characteristics. And they were, when you got offshore, it was that every country of significance had to have its own museum. And in the beginning, its own museum might show its own treasures and its local artists and all the rest. But as it got going, it had to have a global impact, and therefore most had to become collectors on a much broader sense. That's the first thing. The second thing is, in the United States, most major museums were expanding. We have 3 that are expanding at the moment in New York. And all you knew, looking at all these museums, is where are they going to find the great pictures to hang up in these places? Now, in most worlds, when the demand is enormous, you raise the supply and you meet them and move on. The thing in the art world is talent is not that way. Every generation maybe produces 10, 12, or 14 memorable artists. And all the rest of these artists out there now, there's no sense that that's going to change. So you have a whole situation in running a museum of how do you represent yourself and place yourself in a world where there's much more competition for the best works, much more competition for the best shows, and an audience that is getting more intelligent and learn. The other thing is the focus of museums is changing. When we did our second expansion at the Modern, I told my colleagues, I said, this time around, we're not building a museum. We're going to build an entertainment center. We're going to anticipate 10,000 people every day, many of whom are going to be young, who want to come to the museum for an experience, a broad experience, which includes both looking at art, but also includes restaurants, ways to meet people and go forward. The one thing that I saw about MoMA that I thought made the whole thing is we started a program of Free Friday afternoons, sponsored by Target. We give them their thing there. And you'd go on a Friday afternoon, and there'd be a line around the block because you could get in free at 4:30 or 5. It was young people. But you could buy a ticket up till 5 o'clock and not wait an hour. So I thought about it for a while, and I realized the people on the line, it's not for the $20, it was a social event. It was social networking. They loved being online. It gave them a chance to talk to people, they hung out, they met people, they got into the museum. So the role of museums is changing. The third thing is commerce, dealers, and collectors. We have a very distinguished collector here in Mitch Rales who can talk about all three aspects of this. But I think the one thing to say in this period is that the price of art has gone up so much that it can't any longer just be considered a hobby or something that you can deal with on an ad hoc basis. For example, for museums, MoMA was built on gifts from its trustees, right through the 20s, the 30s, the 50s, the 60s, the 70s. But those gifts were from people who had been big art collectors, but the art was probably 5% of their net worth. The best pictures cost maybe $200,000 or $300,000. So this was a joy to do it and something you could do easily, but it was crucial to building a museum. Now art for many places, many people, is 50% of your net worth. So all of a sudden, instead of a $200,000 picture you like, it's a $20 million picture. And that changes a museum's relationship with its trustees and its potential donors, because they have to think very carefully about whether they want to entrust that asset, yes, it's become an asset, to a museum, and where their obligations lie. Collectors and museums have to work together to solve this problem. Otherwise, you'll find out the works of art don't wind up in the museums because of these situations. So the third thing is commerce, art, and we're going to explore the role of auction houses and the perspective of people all the way through. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to start with each of our panelists and ask them a similar question, but one that's just a little bit different, and start with Philippe, because he's the only one in the place that runs a public museum. We have, on the other end, someone running a private museum, and just say, in this era where you're taking over a public museum in an increasingly art-interested city, but with these economic pressures on you, how do you manage your museum in this era? Do you have to expand it? Do you collect actively? Do you have to do it by doing more shows? What are the forces at work on you?
Thank you for the difficult questions. The first curveball.
Yeah.
Well, you know, it's. I think it's a fascinating moment for institutions right now because of everything that you have just described. You know, in many ways, we are, as an institution, or institution the size of the institution I run, which is very different than the size of the institution you are used to, MoMA. We are, you know, kind of, you know, we're out of the market. You know, we're out of the market because the market priced us out. There are many things we cannot do. In terms of acquisition. But I think it's, you know, you talk about commerce. I almost never talk about commerce.
Right.
But I talk about transactions.
Right.
I talk about transactions of ideas. Because that's, I think, where the museum should be.
Yeah.
So if I start thinking of the place I run as a place for the transaction of ideas. I think one of the most important thing and the most important aspect of what we have to do as an institution is as much as we can to remain independent from the forces that you have described that are around the museum.
Yes.
And most of them are the forces of commerce.
Right.
It's fascinating for me what you just said about the percentage of network assets that collection represent in people's wealth. And it explained a lot to me in terms of how much museums now are under pressure to eventually compromise on something they wouldn't do otherwise.
Exactly.
So for me, independence is is absolutely key. You mentioned another idea that for me is very interesting, the word entertainment.
Yes.
In 1998, I curated an exhibition called Let's Entertain,
Yeah.
which was
Way ahead of
an analysis of the way artists deal with the culture of entertainment,
Right.
and whether or not artists could actually compete
Right.
with entertainment. And the conclusion of the exhibition was, no,
No.
we lose. If we compete with entertainment, we might get everything we want, but we might lose everything we had.
Yes.
And if you ask me, how do I run the museum? I want to keep everything we have. I'm not sure I want to get everything I want. It's like Barbara Kruger, protect me from what I want. And protect me maybe from, a museum run by measures of success that would go against the protection of the integrity of the institution as a place of knowledge and the integrity of the works of art that we are here to care for. And also because we talk about commerce, there is a very, for me, there is a distinction between price and value.
Certainly is.
And very often the price of art doesn't reflect the value of art. And if you give me a little bit more time, I would like to show an example
Exactly.
of something, and I think it's slide number 28. If I don't know how
Where is he?
this
There he is.
work.
Okay.
Here. This work, this sculpture that you see on this finger is in my mind one of the most important sculpture done over the last 40 years. It's done by an artist from Brazil named Cildo Meireles.
Yes.
It's a work of art that is made of two pieces of wood. One represents indigenous culture in Brazil and one Western culture. And it's a work that Cildo Meireles made as a critique or as a reaction against the domination of Western art in the 60s and 70s. I've been dreaming to bring this work to my museum.
Certainly solves your storage problems.
It does. It does. So I contacted the artist many times, and few months ago, before I went to MoCA, I wrote him and I say, look, when I was with the Dia Foundation, if you agree, and the work is very specific, it needs to be on the floor in a very large room, alone, with a circle of light around it. So it solves the storage problem, but not a display problem. It needs a huge amount of room.
All right.
So I asked the artist, if you agree to sell this work to my museum, I would guarantee permanent exhibition of the work in perpetuity, in a room, alone, in the middle of all the American artists that you want to position yourself against.
Wow.
Or in front.
With no animals.
Sorry?
With no animals.
No animals?
Right.
We didn't go that far in the conversation. And I asked, and after a few months, he wrote me back and it was the first time, he said, yes, I agree to sell this work to your institution. And the price will be $15 million. 1-5.
Gives commerce a new meaning.
And I look at the letter, and I was like, it was obvious that I did not have the money.
Right.
The museum did not have the money. Even if we would have had the money, I would have had, a great day going to my board and saying, we're going to buy this piece for $15 million. And then I understood something that this artist did to me and to the museum. it was about the value. So I wrote him back and I said, I really appreciate that you wanted to part with your work, but I have a problem with the price. The work is so important that I think you are selling yourself cheap. And I would never insult you in acquiring this work for such a miserable value, miserable price, because the value of the work is so big, is so broad, that I think it would be an insult. But why don't you talk to me about another kind of transaction that would actually serve your work and serve the museum? Instead of talking to me about money, make me an offer I cannot understand. And then we can negotiate.
All right.
I never heard anything.
Never heard of that.
But for me, that's the difference between the price, that was absurd,
Right.
and the value that was also absurd because barely reflected by the price. And I think that's where the museum should be right now, in a place of independence from market assessment, so that what we can discuss about is the deep aesthetic, historical value of what we are showing in public spaces.
Yeah. Well, you're talking about ideas too, and principles. That's it. Can we move on?
I'm very happy to shut up now.
Now, Mitch, my first question to you, I'm preceded by another question. You don't have to answer it, but would you collect this for your museum? I'm not going to go there with that right now. And pay the guy
We don't
$15
own this work, but we do own a number of works by Soto
You do.
Morales.
Fantastic. Mitch Rales has combined a very, very successful business career with an extraordinary eye for art, which he's been able to transform into a museum outside Washington, D.C. And in that museum are individual works of art that are so powerful, they're always in demand and say a lot about art on their own and about those artists. So Mitch, we're very happy that you're here. And my question for you is, in the last 10 years, all of this change in commerce and all the pressures that you know well about money and gifts and competition for works of art, how has that influenced what you're doing, and how will it influence in the future, do you think?
Well, thanks, Don.
Yeah.
I think the key issue that we get involved with is focus. We have a strategy. We have a point of view from having looked at museums and artworks all over the world, what's going to be important. And I think one of the things that continues to amaze me today is how people listen rather than look when it comes to the artworks. And I think a lot of the things that are happening at auction today are about listening and marketing for what the auction houses are doing to create great opportunity to sell works for very high prices. I look at an Andy Warhol that trades for $100 million, and I say to myself, boy, if I had that $100 million, I could build one of the great art collections that the country has seen by just staying focused and prioritized. And so what do I mean by that? If you'd pull up slide 33, please. There are 3 questions that my wife and I ask ourselves on everything that we do. When we look at a work, does it change the way that we think about art? You go back to the evolution of abstract expressionism coming into the world. People thought that these artists were communists. They threw eggs at them back in the 40s and the 50s when they were working. This couldn't possibly be art, yet today it's some of the most important artwork that America has seen. Is it among the very highest quality objects that the artist produced during his or her career? And is there a rational value associated with it? We've never been scared to pay 10, 20% through the market if it was of the highest quality. So I'm going to throw a few slides at you real quick about art that changes the way that you think. If you just roll to the next slide, please. This is an artist by the name of An Kawar. An just passed away at the age of 80. He made a date painting for every day that he lived, with the exception of a few. Now, he started in the 60s. Who was painting date paintings back then? People looked at this and said, this is craziness. This can't possibly be art. Yet he just got through with a major retrospective at the museum, or at the Guggenheim Museum, that is absolutely beautiful. Roll on to the next slide, please. How about Bob Gober? This is Bob Gober's, a replica of his leg with an anchor on it. Could that possibly be art? Well, I think more and more as I look at things, he's changing the way that we think about art as a whole. The Museum of Modern Art just did a full retrospective on Bob's work, and it's absolutely wild. We'll never know for the next 20 or 30 years whether this is the real deal, but it's close enough in changing the way we think about art to give us a fighting chance. This to the next slide, please. This is David Hammons, an artist that Philippe has passionately talked about before. This is called Which Mike Do You Like? And it's really referencing Mike Tyson, Michael Jackson, and Michael Jordan. And he's making a profound statement about the history of the 80s for the most part, when these folks were in their prime. You know, will it survive the test of time? Don't know for sure. Does it change the way I think about art? Absolutely. And finally, the next slide, please. Jeff Wall, I believe one of the great artists of our time today. He works with photography, but he doesn't consider himself a photographer. He considers himself a painter. And he's looked at art history, and this was a very famous work that was done back in the 16 or 1700s. I forget the exact time, but he made his version of a destroyed room and curated this room himself and then photographed it. And the artwork survives in a light box as a photographic work as a whole. So that's the way that we consider thinking about art and commerce. And you know, these aren't $100 million objects. They're certainly not inexpensive, but these would get you started on the way to building a world-class collection, you know, with the money that one Andy Warhol or one Picasso or one Giacometti could bring today.
Absolutely. I think that's a very good introduction to people who collect, for sure. Now, Kavita is both a collector and a protagonist for the art of her country, Nigeria. And she represents on this panel a very important aspect of what's happened in art, which is art is going global. And in the course of going global, it is finally, although slowly, reaching third world countries or emerging nations. And she has been able to take what's going on in Nigeria and convert it to a combination of scholarship and commerce, including starting her own auction house. And so I hope she can tell us about those things.
I'm very excited to be here and talk about my auction house that I started in 2007. And the reason for that was that there was no transparency of price in Africa. There was no secondary market. There was no international platform to showcase the art. And so we did that because we had a model of India, which had started in the 80s. I'd actually started collecting Indian art in 1983, 84. And there was a huge gain because of the auction houses that were participating in India. The first one started in 1989. Christie's came in and did a charity auction, and they raised about $300,000 for the charity. Now, auction houses that sell Indian art, like Christie's and Sotheby's, have their sales at about $6 million for each auction, and they have 4 a year. So, you know, it's grown dramatically. And so we thought, as there's nothing here and nothing showcasing African art and becoming another emerging market, how do we do it? So we started this off, and at the first auction, in fact, I can go to slide 5, which is a work done by a veteran artist who's about 80 called Bruce Onubrookpai. And this work was actually estimated at about $30,000 to $40,000. It's a panel made out of bronze foil and ivorex, a material that is meant to look like ivory. And we were sitting there together, and there was a price war going on in the room, and the work went for 3 times the amount. So it went for about $87,000, which is the average a Nigerian will earn in his lifetime. And he was so shocked, he jumped up in amazement. And a few days later, I went back to see him, and I was giving him his check, and he said, "Oh, no, I can't take all this money. It's way too much." And I said, "No, this is the whole reason we want to get the prices going." He said, "But how is this medium going to carry on if I don't give you half of it? Because I don't want this auction house to stop. And since then, we've had great successes with artists. We've had modern artists who've been working with us. In fact, if you can go to slide 8. This is a modern artist that actually was influenced by European modernism. He was painting in the 60s during Nigeria's looming independence and did a lot of works. And this work actually sold for $192,000 in November 2011. The first one we had actually sold for $12,000. So the gain from 2000 to 2011 is quite huge, as you can see. The next artist I want to talk about is Ella Natsui, which I think most of you know. He's just won the Golden Lion Award for an artist at the Venice Biennale. And in fact, this year, if we can go to slide 12. He did this at the Biennale in 2007 on the facade of the Fortuny building. And since then, he's actually been owned by many museums. I mean, the British Museum was one of the first to buy him. The Met has a few, many institutions in America have his works. And he's the only African artist that still lives and works in Africa and has an international presence. He's actually done amazingly well, and he was bought in a fund in 2011. And in 2013, after he did the facade of the Royal Academy in the UK, he sold his work at Sotheby's. Well, he didn't, the fund did. And they achieved $1.1 million for the work, which was a 78% gain in 2 years. So we've been seeing huge gains in the market. And in fact, he started off with woodworks, which we have over here. And if we can just show slide 15. He did many mediums, and this is what he was doing in the 90s. And the strips of wood have been cut by a chainsaw, which shows the colonization of Africa. So what he's trying to say is that the Europeans came and just chopped us up anyhow. And the black burns on the works are actually Africans suffering during that period. So he really is quite political and has great diversity in his work.
Terrific. Well, that's a very good summary. And she has done this in this poor country that had no link between art and commerce. What I'd like to do now is move toward the headline, which is toward art, commerce, and dealers. But I want to get there in some steps, which I'll put my friend on the left on the spot more than I will my friend on the right. So I'll start with my friend on the right, which is, I want to ask you about, and I'll go into them a little bit to give you a chance to think, Leonard Lauder's gift and Eli Brode's forthcoming museum. Leonard Lauder, they're both friends of mine. Leonard Lauder, over many, many years, built an extraordinary collection of Cubist painting. So I think almost everybody knows Cubism is the real transition between old art and new art, or traditional art and modern art. It began roughly in 1908. It works its way through analytical Cubism, which is the true high point, into synthetic Cubism and on. And Leonard Lauder built a brilliant collection of these works of art. In his apartment, you'd go there. I loved it because as I walked in the door for a dinner party, he'd grab me and say, I want to show you my most recent 3 things. And he made a gift to the Met that was extraordinary. It was not only extraordinary because of the quality of the works, but he gave the gift in a form that was unrestricted. That is, the Met did not have to keep the collection together. It did not have to show all the collection. It could use it for what was in the best interest of the museum. Doesn't happen very often. In fact, there was a giant opening. The result of that opening was the works were divided into 4 artists: Picasso, Braque, Juan Gris, and Leger. And it did wonders for Juan Gris. I'm not sure it helped Leger so much, but it did broaden dramatically the audience for Cubist work, and it sets the stage for the Met's next step in their evolution, where they're taking over the Whitney's old Breuer building, and they're going to build a modern and contemporary wing down below, spending at least $500 million. Eli Brode, as you probably know, has been collecting for 40 years. He's a brilliant collector, Very contemporary. Jeff Koons would be high on Eli's list of things that he's been doing for a long time. And he has had several different involvements with several different museums in Los Angeles and has settled for this thing on building his own museum, which opens September, I forget what it is. So Mitch, you want to take those two on?
Well, the beauty about Leonard's gift is its high impact.
Yeah.
And I think for museums to survive on a long-term basis, they're going to need patrons who give high-impact gifts. He single-handedly transformed the Met's modern collection overnight. And I suspect as a result of that, the Met will attract other impact gifts because who doesn't want to hang with quality? I mean, it's a great thing, and he should be applauded for it, and I think the Met will become a big winner going forward as a result of that. Eli's doing a very different thing. Eli is founding his own private museum. He wants to show his collection. And if you look around the country today, many of the great museums were founded by people like Eli on a private basis as a whole. You look at the National Gallery of Art, the Mellons. You look at the Menil in Houston, and we can keep going across the country. But today, some of the greatest museums that the country has seen, the Whitney in New York, the Walker in Minneapolis, I mean, these were all founded privately and have become some of the great institutions, and I suspect Eli's will one day as well.
I think Eli would really like to hear that. Whoever's taping it, please send a copy of just that statement to Eli. There's a big article coming out on Eli in the Wall Street Journal magazine in a week or two. Philippe, how about you? How are you going to handle this question about Eli? But let's you take Leonard first.
Well, I totally agree with your statement. It's a game changer. For me, it's also a very interesting game changer, you know, in an encyclopedic institution moving towards the 20th century, forcing us, we're in the end of the 20th century and in the 21st century, to be even more aggressive and experimental when we see that the Met is going to be an important player for contemporary art.
Exactly.
For the other part of the question, well, you know, I believe in the diversity of the gene pool. I think, you know,
Expand, please.
I think more is more. I think also that, you know, when Eli will open his collection, we will at MoCA, across the street, also dedicate our entire building to our permanent collection. And I think it will be fascinating for the audience to see two very different traditions of collecting. You know, a private collection going public, and a collection that has been public for 35 years. You know, and we've been talking a lot, actually, Eli and his team and my team. You know, across the street from each other, you'll be able to see some of the most important works of art produced over the last 40 years. Will benefit his audience, will benefit, you know, the attractions that the building will be, and down the line, it can only, for me, at the end of the day, if it benefits the artist, if it benefits the audience, then we're doing something meaningful. And I believe that with his commitment to living artists, our commitment to living artists, the way the two institutions can serve the audience, that it's only positive.
Terrific. Yeah, Eli's done an extraordinary job with this collection too, don't you think?
It's a fantastic collection. It's also a very different collection, and you know, there is. I'm happy to show you one of the works that I consider one of the most important work in our collection.
Yeah.
If
I knew you'd want to do that.
I knew you knew, which is slide 29.
Yeah. That's a little harder.
It's hard. We own two
collect.
huge halls in the desert, 2 hours outside of Las Vegas, a piece from 1969 by the artist Michael Heiser, who cut two huge holes parallel to each other, in front of each other, in a mesa in the desert. It was, you know, what you said, Mitch, about art that changed the way you think of art. In 1969, that that was a revolution.
He was.
It's in our collection,
As with Smithson.
as with Smithson,
Same
and
time, yeah.
you know, Eli's tradition of collecting goes in a very different direction. To be able to show Jeff Koons, who thinks beyond conventional wisdom and create beyond conventional wisdom, and Michael Eisner, who create beyond conventional wisdom, I think it's totally complementary.
All right, let's move then to the relationship between artists, collectors, and dealers. There was an article in the art newspaper first and then picked up in other places that the vast majority of the shows of established artists for sale were now done by only 5 dealers, five mega dealers, of which David Zwirner and Larry Gauguin are probably the best known to Americans anyway. There's also been several articles and in several in fact things that artists are no longer restricting their work to one dealer. They want several dealers. They want a dealer in their home city, they want a dealer in Europe, probably London. They always want a dealer in either New York or LA or both. And the other side of that, of course, is that means these artists have to produce enough work to satisfy the economic interest of these dealers overthrough. The third thing is the dealers themselves have gotten much, much bigger. And the argument is it gives them much more power. Several dealers, and I know them, many dealers, in fact, promote their artists by getting museums to do shows of them. That's part of the thing that they offer. They promote their artists by telling them that they will get them represented in certain collections in different cities. All good things economically. What I want to explore today is all this good for the artist, because it puts the pressure on the artist to make more work, and particularly to make the work that artist that's recognized, as I said earlier, the work that collectors come to see. The next thing that goes with all this is the rise of the mega studio for artists. Damien Hirst is probably one of the first and one of the most significant, because he turned the art world on itself. He figured he would take the advantage of commerce and take it back. Instead of making the work himself, he had a bunch of assistants make it. By the way, that went on in the 16th and 17th century too. And that he would reprice it and change the way these things work. And there's a number of others that are in the same position. So you have this change in the economics of art, in the making of art, and the marketing of art. And most of it comes about, obviously, because of the demand for art and the willingness for the marketplace to pay prices that will finance what are obviously extraordinary increases. So I'd like to, again, ask all 3 of our guests to comment on that. Mitch, you want to start? It's something you know a lot about.
Well, let's start first with the fact that no matter what's happening today, art history will sort everything out 30 or 40 years from now. We can talk about artists in the 80s that were the first $1 million babies that are not relevant today. I'm not going to go into names. It would be.
I told Mitch this before we start. I'm going to give you some names.
but art history has a way of bringing the playing field back to a very level place. So all that being said, this is all rhetoric that has to be sorted out today. I do personally believe that as money becomes an issue, artists' works generally go downhill.
Right.
You take an artist like a Bryce Marden, as a for instance, who we believe is, I know Don would share this, we believe is one of the great artists today. Bryce doesn't set a time for when his next show is.
No.
His next show is when he's done creating the work. He could be the slowest painter in the history of mankind.
Right.
You know, maybe offering 5 or 6 paintings over the course of every three years. So money has not affected Bryce, and as a result, you know, his production has really been terrific. But I can name, which I won't, several artists that have gone to big dealers who we used to collect but have not collected since because the art just isn't at the quality level anymore.
And that's the point I want to make to this audience. If you're collecting, that's something that's very important to remember. It's been diluted. All right. Bryce Marden's an extraordinary artist. I was in his studio one day, and he showed me a picture that I'd been waiting for 2 years. And I looked at it, it looked great, and I thought it was fine. It was 6 panels. And I said, well, Bryce, can I take it home? He said, maybe in another year. He was still thinking about various aspects of the thing. Now, this is a little different world than yours. Would you like to comment on this?
Well, our world has just started. I mean, we have just started with the gallery scene. We're getting more prominent in shows abroad. In fact, with Frieze, we have a separate satellite which is called 154. So if you want to buy African art, you go there and buy it. And we have amazing dealers from France, from the continent. In fact, we also have a space, and we're trying to promote all the artists that we think are absolutely incredible in Nigeria or in the rest of Africa. And there's great representation, and there are 3 major collectors who are now beginning to buy African art. We've got Joan Pigozzi, Frank Cohen, and Charles Saatchi. And in fact, Charles Saatchi just had a show in the UK. The Tate Modern have got an African Acquisition Fund where we have about 30 members, and so we're contributing in buying works for the Tate. In fact, we just purchased an L. We purchased some South African artworks, and they've had 2 shows recently, Meshan Gaba and Ibrahim Al-Salawi from Sudan, just to show that Africa is there and we have a presence. What we're trying to do is become more global and come out to the US and be able to participate in museums and have dealers representing our artists. But we're on the ground floor. We have a lot to go.
Well, there is an obvious evolution with the art market that happened over the last 10 years. I would say that even before, when I started as a curator about 20 years ago, the art world had a market. Increasingly, the artwork might become a market. So there is a difference between the have to serve the artist and the is.
Yes.
That for a museum is extremely difficult. But again, we, as Mitch say, art history will do the work. Increasingly, we are under pressure by machination of the art world or the commerce of art to bring to our doors with, I would say, very good opportunities to build market for artists who do not have market. And then we have to be extremely careful to never enter this game. Yeah. We have curators, we have expertise, we need to trust that. For the artists that you mentioned, it's also fascinating. Recently I went to the artist Paul McCarthy's studio here in Los Angeles. Paul McCarthy is about 70 years old, does performance, sculpture, film. The studio is 265,000 square feet. And it's one of the studios. And I've known Paul for 20 years, and I look at Paul and I say, Paul, I can fit 3 mocha in your studio. What do you want from me? What can I do? You have, an entire foundation of galleries behind you. All that is possible. I can buy your work for you from your studio. It's not going to make any difference for you. I can do an exhibition, but you have more room in your studio. What do you want from a museum today? Exactly. And he looked at me and said, I'm not sure that I will be in the history book. So what I need from you, I don't want more commerce. I want to make sure that if I work with you, when I work with you and with your curators, I will be in the art history book. And I listen to what you say about the situation of Africa today. For me, one of the most interesting part of art history that happened over the last, I would say, 20 years was an exhibition curated by the Nigerian curator, Okwi Enweze, called The Short Century, which was a very interesting analysis of the last 40 years of art making on the continent of Africa. And for me, that's, between what you do and between what I do, we need to overlap to make sure that not only the artists reach the price, and then I want artists to make a living, but we can contextualize it so that we understand the importance of an image, an object, when it comes to the collection.
If you wanted to, sorry, do you want to?
Sorry, just one thing on Okwi Enweze. He's actually the curator of the Venice Biennale this year, which is the first time an African has ever done this show in the last 150 years. And we have 35 African artists that are participating at the Biennale.
If you want to see the message here that, as Mitch said, he's not going to mention the artists, and I mentioned to him, I guess I'm not going to mention it either. You've intimidated me, of the rise and fall of the art world and the fact that maybe there's a dozen in every generation who make it, do two things. Get whatever museum you know to show you the basement and the storage. And you will see hundreds of works by hundreds of artists that look good at one time that aren't anymore. And second, if you want to see it right away, at the opening of the Whitney, for example, and the opening here, go and see what the artists are that are hung up in these major museums now, the younger ones or the newer ones, versus what they hung 5 or 10 years ago. It's a very challenging thing, and anybody thinking of so-called investing in art should realize the odds of a young artist making it into these realms where they're even mentioned by these gentlemen are probably 100 to 1 at least. Now the mega trend that we've heard about here extends beyond all the things that we've talked so far into museums themselves. And what I'd like to ask the panelists are about what do they think about New York, where 3 of the major museums are undergoing major expansion. The Museum of Modern Art, which I'm very much involved in, is expanding substantially. We will increase our gallery space probably 40 or 50%. The Whitney Museum has just opened a new museum downtown, brand new, that has a multiple of space that they had before. And as I said, the Met has great ambitions to build a modern and contemporary wing, which will substantially increase the Met's impact on art, enhanced dramatically by Leonard Lauder's collection, which, as I said, links the old and the new and gives it a base that it didn't have before. So the question, gentlemen and lady, is what do you think about these expansions? They're going on here in LA also, they're going on in other places. Do you think they're warranted, and do you think they'll have enough pictures to hang up in the end?
I think it's a great thing.
Yep.
And it's almost, for me, a love-hate relationship, though.
Yes,
The love of it is the accessibility of people to go and look at art, socialize, enjoy all the different things that the museums have to offer. The hate side of it is it's impossible to sit in front of an artwork in New York for longer than 30 seconds, and everybody's got their cell phones up and they're trying to take the picture, and people just don't have a chance to look. And for me, personal engagement with an artwork is critical. I'll never forget the time that my wife and I were at the Reina Sofia Museum in Spain, and Picasso's great piece, Guernica, is up. And they limited the number of people that could go into the room at one given point in time. You got to really experience the art for what it was. So I think the face of museum world is changing pretty radically, and time will sort this out, as well, because it's going to be a capacity issue after a while.
I think it is. I used to collect the originals of the New Yorker's art cartoons, and the one I liked on this topic was this funny little couple rushes up to the Metropolitan Museum. You can see them walking up the stairs, and they go to the guard, and this was the time when the Met had gotten the new Rembrandt, Aristotle contemplating the bust of Homer, the most expensive painting they've ever done, and they say to him, "Where's the Rembrandt? We're double parked." How about you?
Well, it's not hatred in my case, it's fear. I mean, I think I agree, I think it's great. More people are exposed to art. I think we gain as a civilization. I would look at the motivation behind an expansion. Is a museum expanding so that the museum can pay for the former expansion, which is not finished, like to pay the debt of the former expansion? Is that an inflationist curve that we need to consider? It's a question. I also, for me, the motivation is the expansion of the museum. Does the expansion of the museum serve the artist and the audience? If it does, it's great. When I started at MoCA, someone came to me and said, "Are you going to expand the museum?"
Yes.
I said, "Yeah, of course, we're going to expand the museum, of course." And the person asked me, who's going to be the architect?
Yeah.
I said, oh, no architect, no architect. And it was like, what do you mean, no architect? You know, no Frank Gehry, no Rem Koolhaas. No. I said, no, we're going to expand on the mission.
Yeah.
We're going to expand on the mission of the museum to serve the artist and the audience. And it's why I was showing this image of a work of art that cannot be contained. I don't know really what art will be in 50 years. If I expand the museum, I don't want to expand for more of the same. I want to expand the museum in a way that will trigger progress not only for the institution, not only for the experience of the art, but for the ability of the artist to take us somewhere we haven't been. And there is a fantastic institution in Brazil talking about expansion of the museum, expansion of the idea of the museum called Inotim. It's a collector who have a huge piece of land. I'm sure you've been there in the desert. You know, not in the desert, in the jungle.
Yeah.
And he worked with artists one-on-one. And he asked the artists what the dream. And he built the dream. So the expansion is triggered by the desire of the artist to do a new work, and for this new work to be hosted in a pavilion, and the work to be cared for. And that, I think, is a fantastic way to expand not only on the facility, but on the idea of what a museum is today.
They're flashing a red light in front of us. What does that mean? Because we have lots more questions. Do you want to say anything about this, other than you'd like to see the expansion full of Nigerian art?
Well, we'd like to have some representation for sure.
Yeah, okay.
We can definitely contribute in all these empty spaces that you have.
Okay. Whoever's running this, is this it, or we have time to take questions from the audience? What, he's holding a sign. I can't read what it says. Can you, Philippe?
You might have a question.
Oh, great. Well, let's take a couple of questions until I stop us if you're interested. All right, the man who's bravely down in the front. Yeah. Yeah.
You started off this showing the principles which you collect on.
Yeah.
But then the group is talking about young artists and one out of 100 make
Yeah. Yeah.
now when you're buying art for the museum, or Don, when you're buying art, or you're buying African art, or you're buying new art for your museum, how do you determine, and what makes you think that this artist versus the other 99 that aren't there are going to be around 5-10 years from now?
But you go first, Mitch, and then I'll...
Well, we have one very important rule that we impose upon ourselves without exception. We will not buy an artist unless he or she have been working for at least 15 years.
Yeah.
That gets you out of the venture capital business and gets you into buying real companies because it's just too tough. Go look at Wimbledon. In the 50s, there were 50 tennis players, and on the men's side and 50 on the women's side, 10 were great. Today, there's 1,000 players on the women's side and 1,000 players on the men's side, and 10 are great. It's the same in the art world. It's really, really hard to figure out who's going to be great. 15 years gives you a fighting chance, and at the same time, you got to ask that first important question. Does it change the way you think about art?
Yeah, and I would ask, I asked the question, to be a great artist, I think first you have to done something that hadn't been done before. That gets harder and harder. For example, we've lost beauty in the art world over the last 10 years, I think. And then secondly, has what you're doing inspired other artists to do things that follow you? Now, there's only a handful of artists where that works. Roy Lichtenstein would be one, and Ed Ruscha here, if you're thinking about pop art. But if you can find those artists, and we found a couple, then you have a chance if they continue to grow in that form.
We're going to have to end this now. We have another session coming in, so please thank our panelists for a great session.
Okay. All right. Okay.
Thank
All right,
you.
my friend.